Welcome to our podcast. We're on call. We are going to be covering episode 7 of On Call, the Amazon Prime police drama. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Omar. How you doing, Omar?
Good, good. How you doing?
Fantastic. All right, so this is episode 7, the penultimate episode for season 1. So why don't you
Yeah.
take it away, Omar? Let's just work our way through the episodes.
So scene one opens. It looks like it's inside the station. The scene begins with a view of plaques on the wall, and it looks like plaques of officers killed in the line of duty. And as the camera's following the plaques along the wall, obviously the last one is Officer Delgado as the most recent and last plaque. And so Harmon is, speaking to some what appears to be Officer Delgado's parents inside the police station and showing them the plaque and having a conversation with them, saying that Officer Delgado, will never be forgotten. And while they're talking, the mother shares with Harmon that, Officer Delgado really loved wearing the uniform, really loved wearing the police uniform. And I'm assuming doing the job. I mean, that kind of comes along with it. And then during that time, Diaz walks out of a side door and he has a couple of small kids with him, a couple of small children, and he's talking to them. And it looks like he's handing them a couple of, their sticker badges, is what it looks like. And he's handing them the badges and he's saying to them, hey, look, I'm giving you the badge and now you can fight the bad guys. And as he's doing that, then an officer comes in and tells Diaz that he has a visitor. And so, this first scene here is, I mean, it struck me as one of the things. It really kind of takes me back to just starting law enforcement and police work and, not really understanding the seriousness of the job. When you talk about, you're looking at plaques of those that actually have paid the ultimate price and were killed in the line of duty doing their job. That's what it reminded me of. Is like when you first started law enforcement, you don't really, I didn't fully comprehend the gravity and the seriousness of the job, because I had done other jobs before it, but nothing where, every day kind of took you out to the edge of potentially, a life threatening situation, and a situation you don't know is going to happen that day. It's always going to be an unpredictable deal. You could be having a pretty slow and uneventful shift, and then you get that one call where it's a serious deal and there's going to be some serious risk involved and people could get hurt or killed in some cases. So I don't know how it was for you. I mean, when you first started, if you really kind of had a comprehension of that, or did you kind of learn it later, as you started to do the job?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of hard to go back there in my mind. I do remember early on in my career. Well, I mean, I got into an officer involved shooting, in the first year of my employment. So it came in pretty stark relief, like how serious it all is. But, I don't know if it's like this in Long Beach, but at the sheriff's department, all of our facilities, I think, are set up the same so that when you walk in, you're always walking by those plaques. So we have every facility has a plaque of fallen deputies, or in a couple of cases, the sheriff. Like way back, like when they were on horseback, like one of the first sheriffs from Orange County, and other deputies, and then of course we had a deputy that was killed in line of duty, not too long before I started with the sheriff's department. So I worked with a lot of people who worked with him. And but yeah, I mean, you look at them every day when you walk in, and it's a good reminder, I think. And she's right; they will never be forgotten. And I guess I don't know, like, not to be morbid about it, but you know, you could be the greatest deputy or officer that ever lived, and the day after you retired, nobody know it, the person who gets hired the day that you retire or whatever, they have no idea who you are. They never heard of you.
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. Like it's over. And of course, like I didn't get into law enforcement because I cared about that. But what's interesting is, the only monuments that we have are the ones who've died in the line of duty,
Mm.
and there's people's faces up there that died 80, 90 years ago in the early days of the Orange County Sheriff's Department. So yeah, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We're all, I mean, again, not to be more, but I had a deputy that was working for me when I was a sergeant, and I was kind of joking around but kind of quasi serious. I go, if you got killed in line of duty, your wife, I mean, there's the life insurance, the payout, like the state in addition to that gives your family a lot of money. And I go, your name will never be forgotten. You're For the end of civilization, as long as there's an Orange County Sheriff's Department, like your people are going to know. And then for the anniversaries for these guys, we get an email, and it's the whole story of that officer or deputy, and who they were, and how they died. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's just a constant reminder of that person. And you really don't see anything else like that.
Yeah.
It's so within that community. And of course, and then we have the police officers memorial, which is at the Orange County Sheriff's Department's academy. And I don't know if you ever participated in that, where they have the night vigil. I did a couple of times. When I was a sergeant for the community programs, I was in charge of like organizing the whole thing. So it's quite a thing when you see it. And did you ever go to
That,
DC for?
yeah, there's the one in DC, and I didn't go to that one. And
Okay.
then there's the one in California too, where they do up at the Capitol.
Oh, up at the Capitol, yeah. Did you
Yeah,
ever go to that one?
I did not go to that one. And then at our own department, we have one where they do it at every May. They have a ceremony for the firefighters, law enforcement, and they've got like an area they've set up with the names out, kind of the since I don't know, since 2020 maybe, or thereabouts. They revamped the whole city hall area, so a lot of that's changed. But I did go to that. That was, you go there and there's a moment of silence, and you do the whole recognition of those that died in the line of duty, were killed in the line of duty. And so I mean, it's always appropriate. I think it's definitely, it's important to do that. And they've named some parks. We had a firefighter that was killed in the line of duty, and he was from an area in southern Orange County, and I think they named part of the freeway after him. When I drive down by that area, I saw his name on a sign right off the 5 freeway. So it reminds, it really reminds me, and I'm sure it reminds others, that there's a price to be paid for that. And I wrote it, we're going to talk about a couple other scenes, but it really this scene got me thinking about, like, what does this generation think of the profession? What does society really think of this job? I mean, I know it's changed a lot. There's been a lot of turmoil, and there's been a lot of, I don't know what the word would be, or kind of challenging a lot of the law enforcement authority that's out there. And so there's definitely a change that's happening. I don't know where it's going to take the profession. And it obviously has a lot to do with how society perceives the job and those doing the job. And there's definitely an impact on it, because there's a big gap in those that are trying to hire, like agencies trying to hire people and not being able to hire people because there's just not a lot of interest in the job like there used to be. And part of that has to do with the perception of it. Like, what is it? I mean, if you were to go around and ask somebody that's in their 20s, like when they would first get on, like, what does the law enforcement profession mean to you? What does a police officer, say to you? What is it? What do they
What does it
represent?
signify?
Yeah,
Yeah.
signify. And that would be an interesting conversation. That's part of it, is, and then of course all the scrutiny that's come to bear on the profession is, a lot of them are probably looking at it just from a practical standpoint. Like, I'm going to go into this, and I'm going to be on video everywhere I go, and I'm going to have people yelling at me, and I'm going to be in conflict all day long, and I'm going to have people challenging my lawful authority when I'm trying to just do the job that the community wants the police department to do because there's a function that needs to be done. Because that's a whole nother conversation. We wouldn't have time to talk about that. But if if society doesn't want law enforcement, what do they want that's going to do the job of law enforcement? Because you're still going to have crime. There's still, there's still laws, and how do we go about finding that balance where people are going to give the profession, the respect
Right.
so they can do the job?
Well, we've already kind of seen that because all the, defund the police, all those people who did that have either been voted out or gone 180 on it, and
Mm-hmm.
because ultimately, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and someone's, kicking in your door, there's only your neighbor's not going to help you. Like you got to call the police, and so. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think you make a good point. Like when I was a sergeant in the jail, I'm sure you're in training and stuff at Long Beach. I mean, we do see really exceptional young people coming, still wanting to do the job. It's just there's just the pool of applicants is just more shallow. But I wasn't really I was encouraged, in my last handful of years, kind of mentoring these young folks coming in, as they're preparing. They do a year, they do a couple of years in the jail, and they go to patrol, and just really encouraged by the level of people that we're getting because they do believe still, but you're right. It's a different, it's more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I did not encourage my boys into going into law enforcement. It's just a difficult profession, but so important because we can't live without it. We have to have it. It's just adversarial, right? The
Mm-hmm.
people that you're trying to serve and protect are your adversaries a lot of times, and that's just a job. So,
Yeah. And I think that's what this newer generation probably kind of, breaks it all down to is that, look, this is a job. They don't really necessarily see it as a calling. They don't see it as kind of a higher purpose. And if they're looking at it like it's a job, a lot of them could say, you know what, I can go do a lot of things and make a living, and I don't have to subject myself to this environment, unless they see it differently. I think if you see it like a higher calling, or you're doing something that's kind of bigger than you, then then you would probably say, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to see what it's like, see if I can do it. But if you're not in that frame of mind, you're going to go probably find something else to do.
yeah, you can make more money being an electrician or a plumber, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but of course, and actually the benefits aren't as great as they were when you and I started in the
Hmm.
pension. So, the things that I think were that made the profession so great, the stability and stuff like that, like that's not even there anymore to some degree.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's
yeah.
challenging. It's going to
It's
continue this way.
it's I mean, on just a last thought I had is one of the things is that society expects like a high level of performance from law enforcement all across the country, even if it's a big city or a small town. No, it doesn't matter where it's at. And it really gets me thinking about this idea of what professionalism is and you know what that means to some people. Like if you're talking a professional sport, they're paying athletes, for that level of performance and doing that job. What people would think, hey, they're getting paid a significant amount of money, but they've got to perform. And so a lot of that is tied into, like you said, the pension was kind of tied into that. And maybe that was one of the reasons that it attracted some really highly qualified people. But if you want performance, there's a lot of things that go to make that happen. It's training, it's resources. And, if you just look across the country, is the country willing to say, we're going to invest in that and we're going to get the best people to do that job, and we're going to make it happen? Or is it going to be kind of this, everyone kind of fends for themselves in every part of the country and they do the best that they can, which is the way it's been, kind of up to this point. All
Yeah,
right.
we'll
So
see.
moving,
Hopefully, it gets better. Yep.
yeah. So moving on to scene two. So Diaz walks out to pick up whoever this visitor is or find out who it is. And he sees his mom out in front of the station. And his mom basically starts telling him, hey, look, I've been calling you and you haven't been answering your calls. And I've been trying to get a hold of your brother and I haven't been able to get a hold of your brother. And it looks like she's worried sick about him. And so the mother's, it looks like there's a boyfriend or a male figure in the back, probably the mom's boyfriend. And Diaz just says, "Hey, look, mom, I got him moved to another facility for his protection." And the mom's like, "Oh, like, okay, well, where is he?" And so Diaz is kind of looking at him like, basically, "I'm not going to share that with you, mom, because we moved him so he would be safe." And I mean, his thinking is probably the fewer people that know where he's at, the better. And so the mom still seems a little bit upset. The boyfriend interjects in the background saying, "Hey, you should have told your mom that you were going to do this and that." And Diaz doesn't look like he has a good relationship with him, and basically kind of told him to stay out of their business, mind his own business. And Harmon walks out to the front of the station and, hearing the commotion, goes and talks to the mom. And, she's still upset that, the brother had gotten moved. And the mom says to, Harmon and Diaz, like, he doesn't have the power to do this. He's still kind of a new guy, new person. And he says, someone, like, basically looking at her like, you could do it. And that's when Harmon just says, "Hey, yeah, look, I did it." And it was kind of a Hail Mary. And we did it to keep him alive, to keep him safe. And so there was kind of a little bit of a moment there. And the mom really realizes what she had done for her son, the other son. And they shook hands. And then they get dispatched right after that to what sounds like a robbery call. And they're off to the robbery call. Yeah, so that scene was, kind of family dynamic, kind of on the opposite end. There's always a family dynamic with having somebody in law enforcement, but in this case, the family dynamic is with somebody who's not in law enforcement, somebody who's in prison and connected back to the community, like the other son is with the gang. And so you get a little bit of, the mom, still caring about the son, but now having another son as in law enforcement, that's definitely a really kind of strange place to be. I mean, I wouldn't know what that would be like. It's like you got one son who's in prison and then the other son who's doing law enforcement. It's, it seems like
That'd be
she,
weird.
yeah, that would be strange. It would be, and it seems like she's with Diaz. She's a little bit with Diaz. She's like almost like she doesn't like it, like that he's doing law enforcement. You would think some parents would be
Yeah.
proud of their son if they were doing a job that was out there kind of helping the community and, doing something positive. I mean, some would look at police work and law enforcement as positive. And she seems to really be concerned about the other son who's in prison. I don't know. Interesting.
You know. Yeah, I thought it was a nice moment that she, acknowledged Harmon and shook her hand. That I thought that was nice moment between the two of them. But yeah, I mean, it's funny that he couldn't tell his mom because that would have jeopardized his brother's safety. I'm not quite sure
Mm,
how that makes sense, or more importantly, how they can't keep him from calling his
mm-mm.
mom on
Yeah.
collect. So he's not in protective custody, and even if he was, he'd be able to call on the phone. He's not in the shoe, right?
Right.
So yeah, that it's a little plot
Yeah.
hole, but
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. I mean, it just like, like he could still, it's like he's in a place where he can't make any calls. He's like in this dark, dingy place.
He's in some CIA black site,
Yeah, right. He's on a ship
off,
somewhere.
he's off the grid. Yeah, he's down in the bowels of a ship on the sea. Yeah, no, it obviously, but I mean, but like, was Diaz doing that because she's still connected with the gangs out there in their neighborhood that that information, or that her boyfriend could leak that information or whatever. They didn't really explain that, but
Yeah.
um, you know,
Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, it is on the other side, though. She could be giving up information about where the sun is and this and that, which would obviously probably
yeah,
could cause more harm for.
unintentionally.
Uh,
If she just tells a friend and that friend drops a dime, and then it's all over. So
oh yeah,
they're back to
yeah,
square one.
yeah. All right. So the next scene, Harmon and Diaz are rolling up to this robbery call, and Harmon makes a comment that this kind of area is untouchable, and then it's Smokey's area where he sells weed. So I don't know if it's a dispensary or what the deal is. And as they're walking up to the scene, they see paramedics working on a small child, 7-ish. I think it turns out to be a 7-year-old boy. Lasman is standing over the injured child, and he's looking a little bit distraught. And the victim's bike is on the ground nearby. And as they're kind of assessing that as they're going into the business, Officer Barlow walks up and contacts Harmon. So it's a dispensary, I think, or I thought it would. They're walking into the store, and he's giving them the update that it was three suspects with hockey masks, and it looks like they hit the safe in the back. There's another injured person lying on the ground that's being treated by the paramedics. And so Barlow is giving him kind of the lowdown. He's kind of giving him a tour of the crime scene. So I don't know who's investigating it. They're investigating it or he's investigating it. And he says the suspects took some cash. The security guard had gotten into a shooting out front with some of the suspects. And that's when the boy was struck by a stray bullet. And that's how that injury resulted. And so Harmon sees a witness sitting there in the store who's crying and upset. So she takes a moment to sit down with her and try to calm her down. She does some breathing techniques to get her calm so maybe she can get some information out of him. So she starts to do a little bit of investigating. I thought that whole breathing scene was interesting. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the breathing and how it can control some of that stress and some of that adrenaline that probably hit that witness when the whole shooting happened. And so the victim, the female victim or the witness says that the suspects came in and they were shooting and she thought they were going to kill everybody. And she did say she recognized a voice of one of the suspects. Barlow kind of takes him into the back and shows them the safe and says that the safe was open with some kind of improvised explosive device with like a nitroglycerin or something where they were able to, yeah, it was kind of an interesting. So they somehow blew it open and some of the money got burnt, but they made away with some of the loss. And while they're in the back office kind of looking over the evidence, another robbery goes out with three armed masked suspects. And so Harmon and Diaz, I guess they clear that scene. I guess Barlow's going to handle it, and then they're off to the next one. So I would just say, the first thing is, I mean, obviously you got a robbery and you got some gunfire, but then you get the 7-year-old boy hit, which really could turn into a homicide. I mean, not just a robbery, but could turn into a homicide. And that's going to change the whole nature of that call. I mean, the seriousness of, having a child hit in that kind of situation is going to rattle any community, whether it's in Long Beach or any other part of the county. So it becomes pretty serious when that happens. I mean, as far as the crime, because it
Yeah.
definitely gets elevated.
Would you guys immediately call out homicide on something like that, or did you guys have a burglary unit or task force?
Yeah, we had robbery. We had quite a
Okay,
few
robbery.
detective
Yeah.
details. Yeah, robbery would go and they would go out just strictly on robberies. But if you had somebody that basically it would be like, how serious is it? Should we bring out homicide? What's the condition of the victim? And if it looks like you know it could result in the child dying, then you know, they may just bring him out, depending on how serious the injuries are. And I think later we learn that the 7-year-old does end up dying. I think we get some of that information in a later scene.
Hmm.
But it's one of those things where they kind of just play it by ear. If it looks like the person's going to live or it's going to drag out a while, then they treat it as a whatever the original crime was. If it was an assault with a deadly weapon, then it stays an assault with a deadly weapon. And we've had some like that where you're wondering if they're going to survive, but they survive for 2 or 3 days. It's an assault with a deadly weapon that later down the road turned into a homicide.
Yeah.
They still pay more attention to the evidence and all that, because they know that there could be that potential, but it
Hmm.
wasn't at the time of the incident.
Okay, I think let's move on to the next
Yeah,
scene.
I will say just on the building the rapport though, she seems to be doing a lot of that. I think we're going to see some more of that building rapport with victims.
Oh yeah,
And
I do feel like I mean, yeah, I do feel like Harmon she's seeming more compassionate
Mm-hmm.
in these latter episodes than she was in the earlier episodes.
Yeah.
And and maybe she, yeah, just kind of seemed like a hard ass in the beginning, but now she is becoming a little more relatable, I think, as a person, which
Mm-hmm.
is good. In fact, I think this whole season is the last handful of episodes I thought were getting better and better. In fact, I thought this was a great episode, and the final episode I thought was fantastic. So yeah, and you know when she's sitting down with that the sus or the witness and have her doing the breathing, like that, I've done those exact things
Mm-hmm.
with people. So yeah, I thought it was good, and I think as far as a character goes, I think Harmon's becoming more and more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just add this one piece on really quick is that I mean, this is really kind of, I mean, obviously, officer safety and protecting yourself, being able to function with some degree of safety out in the field is important. But to me, this is like the really the core of police work is being able to relate to people and, kind of understand their circumstance. I mean, it could be the worst day of their lives, and, you're going to be the one they're talking to on that particular day. So they're showing us a lot more of her doing that, and there's going to be more of it later. And so I think that's really kind of zeroing in on what makes a police officer really effective at doing their job. And they kind of highlight a little bit more of that later, I think.
Yeah.
So you got Harmon and Diaz. So they arrive at the second robbery location and they're approaching what looks like kind of a single family home kind of deal. And they see a female victim. Uh, they see a female victim. Let's see. They see a female victim crawling out from the front door. It looks like she's injured, kind of unsure what the injury is. And so as they see her crawling out, they move to her and they kind of start to treat her. Harmon calls EMS, calls paramedics, calls the fire department to come and help with the victim. And as they're out there in the front, she tells Diaz to, basically go check the house by himself. We don't know what the scene is. We just had a robbery, potentially three guys inside. And she's like, yeah, hey, go check the house inside. So kind of sends him off by himself while she's out with the victim. And then while she's out there, Lasman comes up and asks if the scene's code 4. And so there's a little bit of a moment where she's still helping the victim. And then Diaz walks back out and says, hey, I got something to show you. And then they both walk into the house. I'm assuming the house is now safe. There's no suspects in there. And he ends up showing her that it looks like they're trying to get into a safe that's in the wall. And it looks like the place had been ransacked a little bit, looking for other loss and property that was in there. And then Diaz zeroes down on a picture that's in a frame that's broken on the floor. And it has a picture of what appears to be the female victim that's out front and Smokey. So now there's some definite connection to Smokey, and these three guys could be related to that previous deal because that was Smokey's area. So there's some puzzle pieces starting to fall together. And Harmon starts to basically ask the victim for some info, and she's just not providing anything. And Harmon knows now that this person knows Smokey, and she says, hey, I know Smokey. I'm here to help. And the female victim says, well, if you know my dad, then I can't tell you anything.
Right.
So she's not going to get anything out of his daughter. And then an officer tells Lasman that as they're out front now that there's a witness that saw three males get into a SUV. It looked like a Tahoe in the middle of the day. Lasman makes a comment that it's pretty bold deal to do this during the middle of the day. They didn't really seem to care if they had a bunch of witnesses. There tends to be more people out on on an afternoon than in the evening, and it's a lot easier to see things and provide descriptions. And so they were thinking that it was kind of a emboldened for the suspects to do it in the middle of the day. And then they start as Smokey or as Lasman and Harmon kind of get together. They kind of start doing some, which is the way it works. They're starting to hey, like what's going on here? Let's try to start to maybe piece some of this together. And Lasman is thinking maybe it's a rival gang making a move on Smokey. And then Harmon's thinking maybe it's like an insurrection or some kind of coup d'etat inside their own gang. Someone's going to try to knock off Smokey or something, maybe a power grab. And so they're kind of spitballing it. Diaz walks off to try to interview the daughter, Leona, and he doesn't really get any info from her. That's when Smokey drives up in his red car. He's clearly upset, and he enters, the taped off crime scene as the ambulance is driving away with his daughter. And then they have some words with Smokey, and Harmon is saying, "Hey, Smokey, we can help." And Smokey's like, "Yeah." He knows this is probably payback for him helping Harmon a little bit, and now he's being targeted. And then of course this kind of flips the switch in Diaz, because Diaz is saying, "Well, my brother got targeted because of me. Now you kind of know what it feels like." So there's a little bit of this back and forth that goes on, and Harmon tries to appeal to Smokey, saying, "Hey, there was a 7-year-old boy that was over there at the dispensary area that ended up getting hit on this deal, and could, might not make it." And basically Smokey says, "Well, it's not really his problem in a way." And he says, "I'll protect my family, you protect yours, and that's the way we're going to leave it." And so he ends up leaving, and then you get a hint at what Lasman is thinking about and how he's going to kind of start to solve some of this, because it's starting to spiral out of control a little bit, and there's some back and forth. There could be more violence, and Lasman says he's going to basically, you know, do a what they call a tactical alert, which is they're just going to do an operation that's going to go impact the East Barrio gang, so they can limit their ability to cause any more crime or commit any more crime. And so they're going to go out and do warrants and contact them and arrest them if necessary. And Harmon doesn't think this is the way to go. It's not surgical. It's too broad, and it could stir up a whole bunch of things that could cause more problems than solve. And that's kind of where they leave it.
Yeah. Yeah, when she had him go clear the house by himself, obviously you wouldn't want to do that. You would assume the safe assumption is that there's somebody else in there, so you want to make sure that was all cleared. Like the victim who's injured on the ground, if they're not bleeding out right there, you just say we'll be right back. And if you don't have the assets, you got to clear that house first to make sure your scene's safe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I thought like I mean, clearly, they know where the safes are at. They know where they're going. It's all happening one after another. So yeah, Harmon's clearly correct that this is a inside coup or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And what did you think when Smokey showed up and they just had the ambulance go off with his daughter? Like they could have held the ambulance for him to see his daughter. It seemed kind of
Yeah.
cold. They're
Yeah.
like, get the ambulance out of here. And he's like, wait, it's like I thought that was a little weird. And I don't know if that they did that for leverage because they wanted to get Smokey to give them information or not. But yeah, I thought that was a little funny.
Yeah. The timing was a little bit, I mean, maybe if the doors were closed and they were about to drive off, would they stop the ambulance and let the dad go up in the ambulance and talk to her? But if she was still outside the ambulance and he's showing up, I mean, if it's something where they can wait, 20 seconds or 30 seconds, would they? But yeah, that was the timing on that was a little odd. I
Yeah,
will say that the priorities, like you just mentioned, when they first arrived on scene, is they have the victim, and that victim might need some medical aid, but at the same time, they've got this other competing priority, which is the house that could have suspects in it, and they're just standing out front like they already assume that nobody's there, that the suspects have all left, because they don't know. They don't get that information until a little bit later when the other officers kind of canvassing the neighborhood. So they don't really exactly know for sure. And then she sends off Diaz, who, by the way, is brand new. I think this is what his first week, maybe his
yeah,
second week, and he's already running into buildings solo.
right. Well, yeah, that's yeah. One episode she says don't go off by yourself, and then the next episode she tells him to go off by himself, and then it seems like so. This is episode 7, so this is an odd numbered episode. So that means on the odd number episodes he goes by himself, but the even number episodes he gets in trouble if he goes by himself off to things. But yeah, I mean it's again, you would have more than just one unit rolling on something like that,
Mm-hmm.
like a home invasion or something. You would have multiple units. And Long Beach is a big department. Like, I mean, like how many patrol cars do you have out?
Yeah, so for us, it would not be a problem on those kinds of calls. You're going to get multiple units going, and like for example, if I was a supervisor, if I was Lasman, and I'm hearing that a unit is on scene at a potential home invasion robbery with a victim out front. If there isn't another unit rolling code 3, I would probably be asking for, the reality is everybody would know. They would say, "Hey, we're responding code 3."
Right.
And they're airing it. That's what, depending on what your policy is, they would do whatever it meets policy to roll code 3 to help them to get there quicker. And if they didn't do it, then a supervisor should be getting on the air and sending a unit code 3 to get them more resources faster. And
Right.
that way they're not all out there by themselves. And the reality is too is that if you know you get really, part of it is just the way that the officers are brought up in the department, but it also goes to supervision and how supervision kind of looks at taking care of people. Like for me, it was always about making sure that everybody's safe before we can do anything else. So if we've got to send somebody from another division to go help them, or if
Hmm.
I've got to break somebody off a call that's not as serious, then we're breaking them off a call. They're probably going to do it on their own to go there and help, and then they can always go back to that other call. So it's just about somebody prioritizing that, recognizing that there's a need, and then making it happen. And in Long Beach, there's enough resources where that's usually not a problem because the department is big. They're patrolling a big city, and they would be able to get help pretty quick. And there's always those that are not really out in the field doing specific patrol work, but they're there. They're kind of just doing other things, and then they could go and help. And you wouldn't
Yeah.
even know that they're in that area because they're not out on a call. They're just driving by, and you'll get a couple people showing up
Yeah,
just
I've,
like,
I've actually been on a call where I had a couple detectives roll up. They're out interviewing people in the area, or they're doing something, or whatever, and they're like, "Hey, we heard on the radio, and I'll help you out with whatever." So yeah,
yeah.
there's always assets out there.
And that's a great feeling too. Like when you're out on a call and you're waiting for someone to show up to help, and next thing you know, like you got some detectives rolling up and they're there in 30 seconds,
Yeah.
and they're helping you. It's like, all right, this is.
When I was with Irvine, I had the deputy chief roll up and give me a back
Yeah.
on a car stop because he was coming into the station, and he was rolling by and he saw me, he pulled up, and so yeah, he just stood by, and I did what I wasn't anything serious, but I mean it was just citing somebody or something. It was kind of routine, but yeah, it's a little unnerving when you have the deputy chief
Yeah.
like being 60.
Is he here to help or is he here to watch you? Is he
Yeah, or
evaluating you?
both, or both.
Or both? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, our deputy chief was pretty cool. Like he definitely identified more as a line officer in terms of kind of how he acted, which was nice.
Yeah. Years ago, we would have some, I want to say it was in the 90s, maybe. Years ago, we had, higher ranking officers. They would go out and they'd basically kind of work a patrol assignment, but they wouldn't put all their insignia on, so they wouldn't draw a lot of attention. It's kind of like the professional athlete going out and everybody recognizes them. So they would kind of remove some of their insignia so they would, blend in
Hmm.
as, and they would kind of go and they would answer some calls and they would, they could get a feel for what's going on in their division or what's going on in their area. And, and I think the officers appreciated that, like, hey, they're out here, rolling around with us and answering calls and showing up. They can still do it. They feel
Yeah.
comfortable enough to do it. And so I think it adds to morale, when you see that.
Yeah, I had my chief of police, who was actually a sheriff's captain in my city, went out and just was a second man in my car, and it was only for like half a shift, but basically just kind of chat and then kind of see what was going on, and he was a super great chief, and was a bit of it was a mentor to me too, just personally, professionally, but yeah, I like that. I liked it when they would get out from behind a desk and go and just kind of go check it out and kind of be still in touch with what's happening
Mm-hmm.
at the line officer level.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the challenges today is that is kind of building that kind of, I don't know, camaraderie, esprit de corps, kind of everybody on the same team. It's a challenge nowadays because there's just a lot of conflict between the community and the department, sometimes even between the officers and management, whatever it may be. There's all the, because management, they're trying to run the department and they're trying to do things, but they've got officers that might have some different priorities that they want acknowledged. And so there's always, and then now you've got the community too that's not necessarily supporting the whole department or maybe parts of the city. And, in all that, you got to build some camaraderie and esprit de corps so you can kind of have
Yeah.
that positive vibe when you're going out and working. All right. Let's
Scene
see.
5.
Scene 5. Scroll down to there. It's so Lasman is leading a brief in the parking lot. Looks like they're getting ready to do their warrants and kind of their tactical alert that they're doing. He's calling it, basically being old school. They're going to go out and make arrests. They're going to fill up the jail. Lieutenant Bishop actually goes on to say, this is not about retribution for Officer Delgado. This is about preventing more violence and bloodshed out on the street so that we can prevent kind of this maybe a gang war from happening or an internal gang war from happening. And after Bishop is done, Harmon walks up to the lieutenant and, you know, tells her that she thinks this is going to make things worse. It's not going to make things better. And Bishop goes on to say, hey, look, if you're not comfortable with this, you can sit it out. You don't have to participate. And then Diaz walks up and says, no, she's fine. She's good. And then Bishop looks at her and says, well, then go execute the warrants. And then that's kind of that short little scene.
Yeah.
And so, why does Harmon feel so strongly about the tactical? Or it's kind of like, I think we're seeing a little bit of this, more of this, maybe the empathetic side of her saying, hey, look, there's maybe another way to do it. There's another way to go about getting the info that we need so we can, find the ones that did the crime and resolve it. But then at the same time, the bosses here are saying, we need to keep violence from happening. Violence is already starting. And if we don't do something to impact it, this could get worse really quick. And, if you're looking at it from like a management perspective, they're going to say, hey, this could be even where we're going to have to need, we're going to need more resources and it's going to escalate. And so we're going to try to keep it from escalating. So, there's basically, they're trying to show two sides to how to respond to this, I think.
Yeah. I don't. There's not a whole lot to be said here, but aside from that, I think Harmon is thinking, whatever goodwill we had in the community is basically going to get torpedoed by doing this because you're just going to be rousting families,
Mm-hmm.
albeit families who have children who are in gangs are actually generationally like often the parents were in gangs and now their children are in gangs. So it's a heavy hand move, but you know yeah, I'm just not sure if you're doing it because you're trying to get a lot of weapons off the street. Like if there's some other thing, it just seems like this is kind of it's punitive, right? They're doing this because they feel like this kid was shot. At this point, did we know that whether he passed away or not? I can't recall now.
I don't know if it's been said yet. I think it's
Okay,
said
so
later.
you have a kid who's who might die, and so they're just we're gonna do this because these guys have to pay, and
Mm-hmm.
we're just gonna go in there. So yeah, I think Harmon was right on one aspect that she's like this is gonna hurt our standing in the community. Like what else do we have except we need community that's willing to work with us, and
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of jeopardizing that. But at the same time, you know, by doing this, is this going to stave off like some kind of great gang war,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe is what they're thinking. Because if you got all these guys locked up and you got taking weapons off the street, like that's going to do a lot. Actually, if you start taking their guns away, I mean, that does make a difference. So yeah, I don't know. It's I did feel like the whole thing was a little bit. I mean, I've never done anything like this before in law enforcement. It all just seemed a little bit kind of unrealistic the way they went about doing it, especially just having like you wouldn't have it looked like just a bunch of patrol officers kicking in doors and
Yeah.
grabbing people like and
Yeah.
for some and to have to write that many search warrants for that many locations and coordinate it. It just seemed like it was a little not something that we would do in law enforcement. You can serve multiple search warrants at once, and often you want to do that because you don't want one person on the one side of the city tipping off the other person or whatever. But it's very strategic, right? It's not just
Hmm.
kind of we're just going to blanket, carpet bomb like an entire neighborhood. It's more like there's a reason why we're going here. And how do you get a search warrant for all those homes? Like what would be the probable cause for every one
Yeah.
of those locations? Just because the kid who's living there is a certified known gang member? Like
Yeah, they didn't really
those,
go into that. I mean, are they
okay.
on parole? Are they on probation?
Right.
Are we
Now, yeah,
looking
if it
for
was a
evidence of a
probation or parole
crime?
situation, yeah,
Do we
right. If there's
identify
a,
there's a, yeah,
yeah, if there's a crime, but if there's no crime, yeah, if they're on probation, then you have at it, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway, you don't need a
Yeah,
warrant for that.
they didn't really, yeah, and they didn't really go into great detail. And the way they made it look, it was a little bit chaotic.
Yeah, very
Um,
chaotic.
I mean, I know that, we used to have a significant gang unit back in the day. And so the gang unit could serve multiple warrants depending on what the circumstance is. Usually it's related to some kind of event.
Hmm.
And like you said, they're going to probably hit, if it's related to the same gang, they're probably going to hit some of those locations at the same time. So there's not some lapse in between. And then a lot of times too, if they're looking to prevent violence, the result of that is that they do find guns or weapons. They can be, in some cases, they can be taken off the street, and those weapons aren't used or accessible by gang members wanting to do more violence. Not to say they still couldn't get weapons, but it does you know it does add some pressure there to, if they want to continue the violence, they're gonna have to work a little harder to
Yeah.
make that happen. And so the next scene is basically Harmon and Diaz are driving, and Harmon is a little upset that Diaz didn't back her up when she was talking to the lieutenant. And Harmon, again is saying, "Hey, I don't think the tactical alert is the way to go. I don't think it's going to be productive. We're just going to arrest all these people, and they're going to be back out on the street tomorrow, and nothing's going to change." And in some cases, that would be true. They're going to be right back out there. And really, what happened? Diaz believes that the warrants are, they do send a message that we're here, we're not going away, and we're paying attention, with the idea of maybe preventing more violence. I mean, he's brand new. I don't know if he's going to be thinking of all that stuff, but apparently he says, "Oh, I think the warrants are going to have an impact." Harmon pulls the car over and tells him, you know, after he makes a comment to her, like, "I think it's going to help." And he kind of looks at her like, "Whose side are you on?" And then she looks at him like, "What?" And pulls over and says, "Take back that comment. What do you mean, whose side am I on? Like, I'm on the side of doing our job." And so, Diaz then kind of backpedals him and says, "Hey, look, we're just trying to get Smokey, and, maybe I can get Smokey's daughter to talk to us." And so they formulate this plan of, having him go back to the hospital and seeing if they can get her to cooperate to help them get some information so they can prevent an escalation. This whole scene was, I was like, partners, they're kind of more partners in FTO relationship, because they're
Mhm.
really kind of talking like they've been working together for a while. I'm always reminded, like, he's supposed to be brand new.
Well, I
You
think
know,
I think I have a feel like been a jump in time. I don't know, like
maybe.
because I feel like at the last episode, which is the next episode, like he goes in for his end of phase review, and so he'd been on for a month or so, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
I don't know, like it feels like how these events are kind of happening. It doesn't feel like more than a week or so has gone by, but I think it's longer than that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
yeah. I'm not sure either. But that's what struck me, is that they're kind of, it's a little bit more like a, which is, it's fine, because that's what it kind of looks like.
yeah.
When you got a partner, you go back and forth. Somebody says something, you don't like it, you guys discuss it and sort it out, kind of a thing. Um, and then, of course, they're going to go back to the daughter and try to talk to her again. And this goes back to the interview skills and getting, communicating with somebody to see if they can learn a little bit about what's going on. And that takes us to scene 7. Harmon and Diaz respond to the hospital to try to interview the daughter, Leona, Smokey's daughter. And so Diaz goes in there by himself. And he basically does a little bit of chit chat, telling Leona that her dad Smokey is in a tough situation, and if things don't change, he's either going to get killed or you know somebody's going to come after them. So it could be Smokey, could be him, could be her, and so you know he's coming there like he's trying to help sort it out, keep all that violence from happening. And she's even concerned, like, oh, they're going to come for me. And so he says, look, he says, I'm here, trying to give her some reassurance. I'm here, gives her a business card and says, you call me and I'll show up, kind of a thing. And then Diaz gets the name of one of the guys, this Eddie Torres, aka Oso, apparently who was muscle for Smokey, and they got an address and they're off to go and follow that lead. Yeah, so this scene, I mean, it was, basically an interview and talking to her and trying to get some info so they could follow up on it. Um, the only thing about this scene that kind of struck me is there's always that line between how much you can help and how much you can't help. Like he's making himself available when he's not even at work. He says, "Call me." Like, well, what is if he's at home watching a football game, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I don't know, did he give her his personal number? I don't know I mean. So there's part of that which is, you're kind of walking that line where you want to help and you want to be there, but it's one of those things where you do go home and you do have, the job doesn't necessarily have to follow you home, kind of a thing, even though a lot of times it does, especially inside your head because you're constantly thinking about it. But I don't know, that one scene kind of. So scene 8, we got Harmon and Diaz are going to the location and they roll up, and when they roll up, they're looking like they're responding to something pretty serious because their guns come right out. And then Harmon gets on the radio and advises dispatch that they're doing a welfare check. So, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think. But
Right.
she's saying welfare check. They're approaching the house. They got their guns drawn. The front door is open. They look inside. They see somebody sitting in the living room on a chair. He's not really moving. And he's facing the other way. So they can't really tell what's going on with him. And they decide to make entry into the house. When they get up to him, they see that it looks like he's been, shot,
Hmm.
injured, and he looks like he's not alive. He looks like he's deceased after they had already given him a bunch of commands. And so they continue to move through the house. And when they get into the kitchen, they see a subject. Oh, when they look at the person sitting in the chair in the living room, he's got his hands bound up with some tape. So it looked like he'd been, somebody had tortured him or somebody had done some things to him inside while he was sitting in the chair. They move into the kitchen. They see another subject on the ground. Looks like he's been shot. They get up to him and it looks like he's alive. And so they immediately start, doing some medical treatment, some first aid, try to stop the bleeding. And when they're doing that, it looks like they're getting some towels or something. Again, the rest of the house is still an unknown. They still got this guy, but the rest of the house is an unknown. Harmon, the guy kind of stops breathing. And we're going to talk a little bit about their own safety procedures too here when it comes to gloves, because that's another thing that kind of. So Harmon is starting to do CPR because it looks like his heart stops, and she tries to keep him alive. She starts doing compressions. It looks like Diaz concludes here while they're kind of just sitting there and and they hadn't checked the rest of the house. Maybe they did, and they just didn't show it. He concludes that the 3 suspects who attacked Smokey's daughter are likely all dead. And there's apparently little evidence to connect any of it to Smokey as far as these crimes. They got 2 guys there, and then there's a third, but they're thinking the third probably too is probably not going to be alive. And then Diaz suggests, you know, kind of when they're sitting out front and ambulances show up and backup shows up after they do eventually put out what they have, that Diaz suggests that, well, maybe they should just, it's almost like a hands-off approach. Like, let's just not do anything, and then they're going to fix it all themselves, kind of a thing. And Harmon doesn't really like that answer. A victim is a victim. We're here to prevent violence. Doesn't really like the suggestion that Diaz makes. And then over the radio, they hear a gang fight and a group forming at the metro platform, but they're going to wait till detectives show up. So yeah, I don't know the. What do you think about that first part there? Why do you think Harmon advising dispatch over that they're doing a welfare check while they're
Yeah,
walking up to the house with guns drawn?
yeah,
Possible.
it's not a welfare check. So for people who are watching this who don't know the difference, like a welfare check is like, your elderly mom or dad, hasn't called you in a couple of days, and you've called and not answering the phone. Maybe you live in another state, so you call and say, "Hey, can you just drive by and just kind of contact my mom and just make sure she's okay?" That's a welfare check. And I've had those welfare checks where you knock on the door, there's no answer. You walk around to the back, you look in, there's like a person laying on the ground inside, passed away, and so now we're dealing with an unintended death, a death. But yeah, this was not a welfare check. It's kind of funny. I mean, yeah, and like you're almost like, what would you say on the radio? Because they're like so far off the reservation on what they're doing. Like no one knows what they're
Yes.
doing. Like
Yes.
you wouldn't do this in a million years. You'd call your sergeant and you're like, hey Sarge, we just or you'd call your sergeant, hey look Sarge, this is what we're thinking. We want to go out to the hospital. We want to talk to this girl because we think like we have a rapport with her and we think she might tell us stuff. Yeah, that's great. All right. So then you contact dispatch. Hey, just put us out on this thing. We're gonna be at the hospital. Then you go do the whole thing, and then you call your sergeant. Okay, he's saying that she's saying that it's this guy and lives at this address. And he's like, okay, I'm gonna get a couple units over there. We'll meet. We'll down the street. We'll come up with a little react team plan or something, and let's drive up and then we'll do it together. You don't just go do all this stuff by yourself because what if you get into a shooting right there?
Yeah.
They're coming out as you're walking up in your welfare check, and then you're like, okay, we're at a location that no one knows where we're at. Now we're in a shooting. Yeah, of course, like you would, this it wouldn't happen anyway like this. But again, the TV plot demanded it. But
Right. Right.
yeah, it was. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of problems with what's going on here.
I mean, it's not to say you can't show up to something that says it comes out as a welfare check, but they're putting themselves on. They're saying
Yeah,
it's a
no
welfare
one
check.
knows why they're there, where they are.
Hmm.
Like all of a sudden they're like 10-8, and all of a sudden they're at a welfare check, and you're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
they get dispatched over like the MDC over the computer? Like, did I miss it?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden now they're like, okay, we got we got a homicide victim, we got all this stuff going on, and you know,
Yeah. And everyone's going to be
Lazarus
wondering,
whoever's
like,
the
well, how are
supervisor, he's
they?
got to be like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah. How did they end up there at this whole crazy shooting scene? And they were going to check on the welfare of somebody. And, you know, and it was all connected to this bigger case that's going on. And they didn't tell anybody. They just went
Yeah,
off on their own and did it. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's a little nuts. All right. So I'm calling this scene 9. So the scene begins with officers needing assistance. They're detaining a bunch of East Barrio gang members. And Harmon and Diaz arrive, and they kind of see this chaotic scene like we talked about a little bit earlier, where they're arresting a bunch of people and they're trying to put them into police cars. And, there's numerous officers out and about. And then Harmon tells Diaz, message sent and received, kind of like, okay, we're doing all this. Are they getting the message kind of a thing? And then Harmon arrives at the booking location and confronts Lasman after kind of seeing this whole chaotic scene going on where they're arresting people and putting people in cars and taking them to jail, and confronts Lasman, basically about destroying the trust in the community that that everyone had built over some period of time. And Lasman chooses to frame it, as basically a decision to crack down. Do we do safety or is it trust? Like he sees it like an either or. We're trying to make it safer. Yeah, we're going to sacrifice some trust, but are we going to get some safety out of it? And he thinks that their crackdown is going to make it a little bit safer. And then Harmon tells Lasman that, she's been doing this job 12 years and, she's worked hard to build this trust. And Lasman kind of counters her by saying, hey, I grew up here. I was raised 5 blocks from this station. My mom still lives here. So basically, don't be lecturing me on, community trust and, you know, having a connection with the community. He's basically saying, I came from the community. And so he says, Lasman tells her Long Beach is not her Long Beach. He knows what Long Beach is because he grew up here and he knows the difference. And then Harmon, believes that Lasman's approach is isn't the way to go. and becomes upset, kind of more upset. And Diaz kind of intervenes and pulls her away. And Harmon tells Diaz that, hey, we have to have a better way to do this. This isn't. She doesn't think this is the better way. And this is what she says, look, this is what I've been trying to teach you. And we got a little glimpse of that with her kind of talking to everybody and kind of building rapport and getting the answers that she needs. And then that's when Detective Koyama walks up and, basically says, hey, that was kind of crazy. It kind of, you know, tough for you to kind of sit up there and talk to Lasman that way. And then he goes on to say that they've got some information about Smokey and drugs, and that could put him in jail, and that could solve some problems. And she wants to know if Harmon's in to go and do that, follow up on it. And she says she is, and the scene ends. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that first part's, I mean, we've already talked about the strategies for reducing crime, crime sweeps, search warrants, parole probation checks, that kind of thing, and targeted investigative follow up. Which one are you doing? Can you do both? Is one the better route? Who decides? Who decides that in that particular situation, based on whatever the information is available, which one do you pick? And if you've got rising crime and it's escalating, and you got to kind of keep a lid on it, what's the best way to keep a lid on it if it looks like it's starting to kind of spin out of control? And then,
Yeah, I guess
yeah.
the best they could hope for is just, when they're you know with these warrants, I'm assuming they're arrest warrants, and so they're, you're not really searching, you're not doing a thorough search of the house typically. If you see anything in plain sight, then that would be good to go. But if you're searching, the warrant is like, hey, we're searching for weapons at these locations, or drugs, I guess, and then if there's anybody there, they all get identified, and maybe there's outstanding warrants for them. Looks like some people are getting, arrested. But yeah, I think the best you could hope for would be taking some weapons off the street, because essentially these guys that they're arresting, they're just going to get bailed out. They'll be back out the next
Mm-hmm.
day if there's even bail. And yeah, so I don't, yeah, I the when Lasman's saying we can either have trust or safety, I don't really think you get either out of this. So, but
A little
it's a
shock and
tactic.
awe. It's kind of a
A little
shock and awe.
shock and awe is exactly what it is.
A little Gulf War shock and awe kind of thing. Oh, not Gulf War. Oh, was right after, yeah, 9/11, the shock and awe thing where you're going to go in there
Shock and
and
awe
get.
was the
Was that
Kuwait.
Gulf?
We
Kuwait,
Yeah,
yeah.
we
Correct.
invaded, yeah, the invasion of Kuwait. But this does kind of remind me of, it just popped in my head. So three guys escape from the main jail
Mm.
a few years ago, and it was a pretty daring escape where they climbed up through, like, it was like, straight from Alcatraz kind of, they climb up through like the water in the up the pipes and through the venting, and then they get onto the roof and they rappel down.
Wow.
And so they clearly had help to do that. And then once they got into the community, they were being, harbored by, and these are some, like, one of the guys was a Vietnamese gang member. One guy was a Hispanic kid, and the other one was a Persian guy who was like a very dangerous person, but tortured a guy to find where his drugs were, and like he mutilated this guy. It was pretty
Oh.
gruesome stuff. But anyway, so these three guys escape together, and I think our SWAT and investigative teams just went into the Vietnamese gang communities and just hit all the cafes and whatever, like, and
I
just put a
know.
ton of pressure on them. And basically the OGs, they had to just say, okay, either we're going to give these guys up, or we're just gonna continue taking the hits and lose
Mm-hmm.
business or whatever. And those guys eventually gave themselves up. So we there it was a very similar type of thing, I think. But yeah, they basically just, went after the usual suspects to some degree, put a lot of
Mm-hmm.
pressure on them, and then got what they wanted, which was these guys to surrender.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. That's we were talking about the strategies, but, this, the other thing that kind of I thought about was, like when you retired from doing law enforcement, We talked a little bit at the beginning when we saw those plaques on the wall, and how kind of some some of that purpose behind doing the job has changed. There was a purpose before, maybe a higher calling, and then you get to the end of your career and you retire and you kind of walk out the door. You know, she's talking about trust, and he's talking about safety. And then it kind of gets you thinking, like, really, what was, like, if you really just break it down to the individual person, and you were kind of talking like when somebody leaves and somebody comes in, they don't really know who you are. I mean, is it any different like when you're leaving the job and you're wondering, like, well, what was my impact on this whole operation? What was my impact for the department? What was my impact, you know, to the city or the community or the county? How,
Yeah,
what was,
it's hard to quantify that, right?
yeah, yeah. What was
Because
your,
I mean, I guarantee there's some individuals out there that said, Officer Martinez, he did this for us, or he talked to me in a way that it changed things for us. And but you'll never know that. You'll unless they come back and tell you. But honestly, that's unusual. I had a little bit of that when I was a school resource officer, where I had students who are at my schools and were kind of young adults coming back and saying, "Hey, I wanted to talk to you. What you said to this made a big difference for me." And when you hear that, like, it's really amazing. Like, because it's hard to know. It's hard to know, like, especially when you're in patrol. You're going from one crisis to another, and you can't fix. Typically, you're just kind of putting out a fire. You can't fix the why there's a fire there in the first place,
mm-hmm,
for the most part, and so you're just moving along. And I feel like we saw that kind of like episode 1 or 2, where she was telling Diaz, like, you can't fix these people, like, they're addicted or whatever. You know, don't be overly invested in that, because your heart's going to get broken. I think is kind of what she was saying.
mm-hmm,
And you have that, but yeah, I just kind of feel like, without knowing those stories, you just kind of feel like you're a cog in a large machine, and that machine, the thin blue line between, chaos and order, like, whatever you want to call it, and you're just plugged into that machine, and then eventually you're gonna get pulled out of the machine, you retire, and someone else is gonna plug another cog in there,
mm-hmm,
and some cogs work better than others, but
mm-hmm,
essentially it's just keeping that machine grinding in a particular direction, which is just maintaining order, so that people can get up in the morning, go to work, come home, and not have to worry about, someone breaking into their home and taking all their things or hurting them. I mean, essentially that's kind of what we're doing. So yeah, when you get to the end of your career, I don't know if you had this, but you just kind of, it's almost like a midlife crisis. You're like, what did it all matter? Like, what did I do? Like, what was the ultimate effect? And yeah, I don't think we'll ever really know truly. I have been blessed with some people, coming back and saying you did this and this. But I think you just have to kind of be content with the knowledge that, like, without us willing to do that, then, there is more violence, there's less safety, people aren't sleeping good at night because they're worried. Like we're able to kind of address those basic bottom of the Laszlo's, pyramid of, needs. You got to have
mm-hmm,
general safety and security, and if you don't have that, then you can't enjoy all the other things,
mm-hmm.
like, so yeah, that's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, I think it was, you kind of wonder about your impact. And like you said, you could have had an impact and not even known and would never know unless somebody told you. But for me, for me, it was just leaving with the satisfaction that no matter what I was doing, whether it was out of patrol or responding to calls, or whether you're supervising, whatever it is, you're just trying to. A lot of times, we'll just take the calls for example. You go to a call. My goal is, and I'll look back on it now and say, it was true today as it was yesterday, that I always try to left that call, whatever it was, just a little bit better than when I found it. It's maybe not be perfect, and it may not be the ideal, but if you go there and, like you said, you bring a little peace and stability, that's better than it was when you before you showed up. And if you can retire after doing, 27, 28, 30, whatever you end up working, and saying, hey, look, I want every call. I try to make it a little bit better. And knowing that you did that at the end, you can walk away saying, hey, whatever impact that was, I can equate that to being, you know, a good thing, as a result of
Yeah.
all that, of all those efforts.
Omar, I think that's a great way of looking at it. And that might be a great way for us to end this podcast.
Absolutely.
All right. Hopefully, we left this podcast a little bit better than the way we found it.
Yes. That sounds excellent.
Okay. So, the next podcast is going to be the final episode, which I really enjoyed. So, we'll enjoy talking about it. And until then,
Till then.
everybody out there, be safe, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.